Prior to the formation of a polis, there existed the polity of the tribe as an extended family, and indeed, the closer family as most would recognise it today. All of these existed as a momentary manifestation of a continual procession of beings, proceeding into the afterlife as spirits or gods. Here, in this world, they can grant boons and protection to the living, but in turn require sustenance which they cannot provide for themselves. The role of the living, first and foremost, is to provide for those in the afterlife with daily sacrifices and the preservation of the family temple and estate. All else follows from this imperative. The responsibility falls upon one man to ensure that the correct rites are followed and sacrifices made, and as the estates are an extension of the temple, the properties must be administered by him. It must be a man, because women are expected to leave the family and join another, and so although a sister or daughter may rank highly in the hierarchy of worship, her presence is impermanent, and thus she cannot lead the worship. This is, perhaps, among other reasons. As tribes grew, and junior branches were created, the hierarchy of worship remained the same, such that, although each household might have their own domestic gods to a degree, they are still often subject to the requirements of the head of the senior-most branch in their tribe. He remained the absolute master, for he remained the head priest of the tribe. All properties, all rights and privileges, all status, was at his sole discretion, as the head priest, the patriarch of the tribe. Even in the earlier days of the polis, this could not be interfered with, nor overruled. The power of the patriarch over his estate was absolute. This structure may well have extended to every Indo-Aryan descended people, not least because of how this seems to have proceeded from the domestic worship of the sacred flame, which, in its original iteration, more literally represented the souls of the dead, who may even have been buried beneath the shrine come hearth. Much of this remains in the Vedic tradition, with its emphasis on fire, or even Zoroastrianism. It's possible to apply this to Greece, Rome, and Etruria with most certainty, and that's where we shall mainly be focusing. But keep in mind that some portions of this will apply to Persia, Aryan India, the Hittites and Mitanni, Germanics, Celts, Scythians, and whichever other Aryan-derived peoples come to mind. It's likely that this is a macro trend which played out across the Mycenaean world, but it is more certain to say that this is how new cities were founded at the micro level. As such, it is a recurring model, unfolding in the following way. A new settlement is founded by an individual patriarch, with an extended family and attendants, but perhaps even a union of multiple extended families or tribes. The core of the settlement, both literally and figuratively, is a temple. In all likelihood, worship is the initial purpose of the settlement. He who initially consecrates the ground of the settlement, thereby officially founding it, is or becomes the leading priest of the temple, and leads the worship. As the spiritual leader, he is the preeminent authority on all spiritual matters, which pertain to worship in the settlement temple, as perhaps distinct from the domestic or household worship, which will likely exist alongside the settlement temple, though of course this is not relevant at the household level alone. Custodianship of the spiritual realm is the primary imperative and purpose of all these forms of worship, else the spirits be angered, or worse, damned. So all must be in accordance with the demands of the spirit realm. Laws are simply a compilation of the accrued demands of the spiritual realm. History is a cataloguing of these demands and laws. Civic participation and function is a matter of taking part in the rites and rituals of the temple. Anyone outside the temple has no personhood, for there are only divine laws. Men cannot create them. Protection by the laws, therefore, is only granted to those who the spirits of the temple recognise. All who are unrecognised are no different to fauna. Knowing the correct rites and rituals is absolutely imperative, as is abiding by them. Therefore, knowing from the past what are the correct methods is of paramount importance. But all other details are irrelevant. The laws cannot be questioned, manipulated, or twisted, because disobeying them puts every spirit and mortal of the temple at risk. All of this together gives the head of the temple, that initial patriarch, absolute power over the spiritual, and thus by extension the secular realm. At the earliest stage, there is no meaningful distinction between the two, with all secular powers being merely byproducts of the requirements of the temple. As this position of head of the temple always passes down the senior-most male bloodline, progeny are incredibly important and closely monitored. Infidelity in women is punished severely, and the purity of the bloodline is essential. The spirits of every prior generation depended on this, as one false heir could not inherit the mantle of head of worship, and would thus damn the souls of the dead to eternal torment, though so would failure to maintain the sacrality of the land, and the proper adherence to the laws. With all power invested in the patriarch, the Anax, the king, he had total power over life and death, to grant and deprive of rewards, and to command at will, but all according to the demands of the divine laws, as interpreted. For reasons varied or unknown, the subordinates rebelled, especially patriarchs of junior branches to the leading branch of the family, heads of their own household temples, but subordinate to the Anax all the same. This would either take the form of returning the powers held by the Anax directly to the gods and spirits themselves. For example, there is no king of Rome but Jupiter. Or they would render the position so ceremonial as to become impotent. In either of these cases, practical rule delegates to the next administrative level down, that of the basileus or archon in the case of Greece, and the various magistrate positions of Rome, most notably the Pontifex Maximus and Consul in their more primitive forms. Thus began the degradation of governance, from justly foundational to political. The defence was always made that it was the rebels themselves who were the more pious, but a secularising act has already taken place nonetheless, by separating temporal power from spiritual authority. In Greek, these kings are titled Anax. In Latin, they are Rex, but both are similar enough to be talked of synonymously. In this outline, the city has been emphasised, but much the same holds for the household temple, junior branches rebelling to enjoy the full privileges of membership to the city temple in their own right, rather than as a subordinate under the patriarch of the household temple. They could not hold property in their own right, nor did they have any rights or ability to appeal any judgment by the patriarch. Only after the patriarchal power was broken could they act as equals. Tying this to a particular point in time becomes difficult, as the degeneration has already set in before written records are readily available. There are only hints, such as the recorded Milesian founder and first king, named Anax in their records, possibly through confusion of title and name. References exist to distinct Mycenaean Wanakes or Anakes, but even at that point, rule has slipped somewhat to the basileus. Though one of the titles claimed by Agamemnon is Anax Andron. It is almost certain that this process of rebellion and degradation was not uniform, so this is to be expected, but it does leave us with a great deal of myth when trying to locate these initial purest forms of the Anakes. The closest well-known example would be that of Aeneas, and slightly later of Romulus. This still puts the example of Romulus as roughly contemporary with the semi-mythical lawgiver Lycurgus, who founded the constitutional order of Sparta as we know it, in a far cry from how it was founded under the original founders. The emphasis on deification of the ancestors and the ancestral spirits, the dimly remembered but recorded and exalted deeds of these early rulers, form much of the mythology that we associate with the ancients today. A cynic might view these heroes as imagined by fanciful minds, but the earlier iterations of their histories were treated entirely seriously, and served to demonstrate the divine favour enjoyed by the city. Not merely reputation either, as one might advertise a country or city today, but rather, because the city is only as powerful and righteous as its divine patrons will allow, a pantheon of great heroes is a sure sign of this patronage. In turn, these figures would protect the city still. Men like Theseus of Athens, Heracles of Sparta, and Perseus of Argos mark their cities out as great. In some cases, these individual hero kings even give an indication of their origin. Cadmus of Thebes, for example, is believed to have originally hailed from Phoenicia, and the Spartans were always conscious of their Dorian invader roots. With great and noble figures like these as kings, their realms could not help but thrive and achieve great things. This did not happen though, so what led to the downfall of the Anax? We are amply equipped with theories, some of which have already been mentioned, but due to the variety of instances, and I would argue the circumstantial nature of the transitions, no single theory prevails on the full. Almost all the theories will be correct in at least one instance, or have some kernel of truth to them, so it's worth mentioning all of them in turn. The succession of the Anakes led to an unworthy, impious candidate. The still deeply pious notables of the city rallied to depose him to preserve the spiritual order. This is the case for Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, last king, or Rex, of Rome, who ascended through the murder of his predecessor. Neither him nor his son did anything to improve their standing, and showed greater impieties until they were ousted by a circle of patricians. Another theory links to this, in that, case by case, there are a surprising amount of sons which don't succeed their fathers. And while in some cases we are told why, usually some great impiety like the killing of kin, in other cases we are not. This seems likely to be due to the loss of records, and considering how familial relations are, if anything, even more relevant than in later history, it seems impossible for there to have been no definite reason for disqualifying them. Instead, it gives us cause to re-examine an otherwise underexplored element, that of the role of women. In some cases, such as Penelope of Ithaca, wife to Odysseus, it would appear that legitimacy is derived from the female line. So too does this appear to apply in the case of Helen and Menelaus. The latter is not in fact the son of the predecessor, nor any kind of blood relation. Instead, it is Helen who is the daughter of the former queen, Leda. Potentially, this ties the Bronze Age Greeks to their contemporaries among the Hittites, at least a good portion of whom maintained matrilineal succession, that is to say, down the female line. In due time, we shall come back to them and give them their proper due, I'm sure. Regardless, authority to rule was derived from marriage to the queen. If the same applies in Greece, it would provide an alternate way to sate the demands of the spirits, that a continuation of the bloodline maintain the temple, while not needing to empower an impious and thus banished son. The son-in-law would simply be adopted, which was an established practice to solve the issue of a lack of an heir. Therefore, it is possible that due to the strict requirements around succession, a generation follows which is disqualified in its entirety, except for the daughters. And so to satisfy the demands of the gods and the spirit realm, which, it must be reminded, are of the most paramount importance, then the succession becomes de facto elective, with the husband of the daughter gaining rule. This dilutes the monarchic principle, and helps to establish a kind of fluidity which enables more movement for exceptional, or, as they would understand it, heroic individuals. But perhaps more importantly, avenues for dynasties and tribes to expand their influence over entire new kingdoms through marriage alone. Despite the way that this succession prized the maternal line for the purposes of authority, the most treasured and seemingly identifying affiliation was still that of the paternal line. So despite being dispossessed of their original inheritance, exiled sons would maintain their familial affiliation, and merely leave to found a new polis instead, seemingly keeping many of the same religious rites and practices. Aeolid, Perseid and Pelopid lines, among others, were able to exert their influence over ever greater areas. How this led to the destruction of the old certainties of the Anakes and the wider hereditary system around them has already been stated, but it is also crucial to note how this viewing of the situation casts new light on the Trojan War. Not only does the loss of Helen represent the loss of the greatest beauty of the world, and a great insult to Menelaus, but also his right to rule, and a massive blow to the tribe he shares with his older brother, Agamemnon. Thus, the tribe must mobilize in its entirety, and call upon their allies to aid them. Even only a few tribes might be able to thus call upon a dozen or more kingdoms after this process has played itself out for a few generations. With both sides doing the same, it's easy to see how this conflict may become apocalyptic in scale. Another alternative explanation of the Roman Revolution is that the patricians were afraid of the power which could be amassed in the event of a success in the military campaign which Lucius Tarquinius Superbus was mounting at the time, and what his triumphant army might enforce on their return. This requires a little explanation because hitherto the Anax's position has been treated as absolute, but there were certain natural and practical limitations to the expression of this power. In particular, the administrative apparatus afforded significant privileges to those such as the Archon, Basileus, members of the primitive Senate and others. Even if they were religiously beholden, agreement and cooperation was still somewhat required, at least by members of a de facto aristocracy below the Anax. As such, given a strong enough army under his direct control, and a great deal of money, he could end certain privileges which his subordinates might have acquired over time. Thus, the patricians had to strike first. Even the mention of these different de facto forces and factions implies another explanation, that of the withering away of the office's authority. This could occur either through greater sought powers and position of the subordinates, or the lack of desire or ability to wield the full powers held by the Anax himself. The result is the same. He is first reduced to a ceremonial position with no real power, and then, one way or another, the position ceases to exist entirely. This seems to have been what happened to the king of Athens. There isn't so much a definitive endpoint. Rather, after Codrus of the 11th century BC, the term ceases to be used. Instead, his sons take the title Archon, though, as mentioned, this is a position which already existed prior, and so seems to have overcome the official kingship in relevance. Already in the court of Agamemnon, there seems to exist a deference towards the whims of the masses. So if this theory is correct, it might be a sign that the degradation and loss of power is already in full swing. Another theory, somewhat inverting a previous point, suggests that the requirements of military developments precluded the kind of direct kingship that the Anax represents. Instead of the small-scale raids and skirmishes of the Greek heroic age, or even the elite chariot warfare of the Mycenaean age, phalanx warfare became the order of the day. The kings found it harder to effectively mobilize such forces, as it is a less resource-intensive and more manpower-intensive method, so the necessity of making concessions to the multitude would erode the traditional power of the Anax. This process might be accelerated by the battlefield success of polities which adopted these measures first, democratizing, one might say, which would force their opposition to either copy or be subjugated. Although we typically view the ancient pantheons of gods as static, this was not so. It was the result. As previously stated, the laws, identification, and personhood were initially derived from the tribe and the polis or city, not so much in the broader category of Greek or Latin as we know them. In the process of these larger pantheons and identifications emerging, first internally and then between polities, notions of a sort of equality, even if limited, will have severely diminished the justification for a single all-powerful man to rule. Once even the aristocracy begins to identify themselves as a caste with unified interests, a bastion of resistance to royal power has been created. Even in a more degenerate age, this unification is a process which can clearly be seen in Plato's insistence on a different conduct of war between the Greeks compared against foreigners, namely to not erect trophies in celebration of a victory over other Greeks. Even more so, this is seen later during Alexander's conquest of the Achaemenid Persia, when the treacherous Greek mercenaries were singled out for punishment. Both of these would have made little sense to earlier populations, for whom everyone outside of the city worship was essentially equally foreign, and equally deserving of remorseless subjugation, or even outright extermination. The apogee of this process might be considered to be the universalizing of Roman citizenship under Caracalla. Similarly, the pantheon of gods which we know was not a quick or universal emergent phenomenon. Speculatively, it sprang out of the domestic worship, and was universalized later. This is complicated by the fact that even in the early days, when the cities were separate and fiercely independent, they each had their own pantheon, featuring many of the same gods with only minor differences. Though this does not rule out the theory entirely, it would perhaps merely push the timeline of the development of the pantheon further back. In any case, this is relevant because, especially in the case of Rome, this form of communal worship took on a greater role over time, and became universalized. This is ironically exacerbated by their successes, because Rome forcibly took over custodianship of the idols and physical representations of the gods. For example, all the various Jupiters, Mars, and Minervas of Latium came to reside in Rome. Much of this process takes place after the monarchies have already degenerated or ended entirely, but if we suppose that the process extends in some way further back, we may conclude that the universalizing process had already begun earlier, and along with it, a levelling process between the subjects, many of whom have weaker blood connections to the divine realm directly, or at least no better claim than anyone else to divine lineage. Indeed, this may even be the reason for founding the city in the first place, to provide for the worship of these more universal gods. The process simply continued from there, breaking down the hierarchical bonds in the minds of the subjects. It may also be as simple as to say that once the worst of the outside threats are stabilized, due to the effective rule of the Anax, the subordinates begin to organize against the Anax and apply pressure, trying to acquire additional benefits now that outside threats have subsided. Or similarly, that economic resource distribution put much in the hands of the subordinates to the Anax, and they were able to extract concessions that way. In the context of the rest of what we understand, both of these suggestions appear highly cynical, and not in keeping with the spiritually focused worldview of the people who inhabited this time. Nor do the other powers of the Bronze Age Near East seem to have faced too many problems when exercising control, so there is little reason to consider this to be a necessary structural imperative. This is likely an incomplete list, but it provides enough for consideration, especially given my own views on the decline of the institution, informed in part by an example notable in its absence from the discussion so far. Macedon is one example of a state, such as it was, which did not undergo the same revolutions, or dramatic changes compared to many others in Attica, the Peloponnese, Latium, Etruria, and elsewhere. They maintained an apparently unbroken line from their first mythical founders, to the legendary Philip II of Macedon and his even more legendary conquering son, Alexander III, better known as Alexander the Great. Many Greeks objected to the deification of Alexander in life, and later his successors, and their rule as god-kings as a foreign imposition. But it may just as easily be that they had become so remote from the institution and their own patriarchal founders that they had forgotten where they came from, and didn't recognise it when brought face to face with it again. Of course, even the Macedonian monarchy underwent some changes from how we have described it, for example by taking the title Basileus, and secularising somewhat, but seemingly the fewest compared to elsewhere, places like Athens especially. And while we're talking of them, they represent perhaps the main way that the institution may have been subverted. At first, their kings voluntarily made adjustments to how they ruled, for example by habitually seeking counsel and delegating extensively. This eventually becomes acknowledged, and memories fade as to how the kingship ought to work, and how it was justified. So eventually the powers, once sufficiently diffused amongst an idealistic oligarchy, is given away. In the ensuing century, Athens conquered or liberated, depending on one's biases, many Greek cities formerly under the rule of the Persians, and used their influence to deliberately imprint their own model on others. Indeed, during the Peloponnesian Wars, it was a commonly used method to bind a polis to the Athenian side of that conflict. This was also achieved more peacefully with the founding of later colonies, especially notable in Roman colonies, because while some earlier colonies likely followed the original procedure, later on new cities were an outgrowth of the environment that spawned them, often utilising the latest secularised philosophy to design the new settlement in the optimum manner. Later still, they are little more than a means to diffuse political tension, or as a reward for legionary service. So clearly by that point the spiritual component has been greatly diminished or forgotten entirely. In all this then, whether it is by a cruel twist of fate which ends a bloodline, or the whims of kings to give away their power without the will or means to regain it, almost all the original priest-kings were replaced and forgotten. Only a few survived, and even they did not do so unscathed. By the end, secular politics was firmly entrenched, and the whims and interests of various groups demanded to be considered. But plenty could rise to the challenge, even if their titles have come to us in disrepute. The Archon, the Tyrant, perhaps even the Princeps. They would restore monarchical power through the various means at their disposal, but in quite a different form, and certainly a pale imitation of the kings who had laid such grand foundations.